the body of Bernard Holt was found floating face down in the locked chamber at Talley's Cut on a misty Tuesday morning. The police called it an accident. Retired gentlemen wandering near old lock mechanisms were the sort of people accidents happened to. But a retired accountant like Bernard Holt was also the sort of person who noticed numbers. For days before his death, on a hired narrowboat at Grantley Wharf, he innocently said something aloud that he ought to have kept to himself. The lockkeeper was within earshot. That was the beginning of the end for Bernard Holt, and the beginning of a dark puzzle for Miss Marple. Hello, friends. I'm Jack, coming to you from Ohio, and welcome back to Midnight Pages. Tonight we're trading the English countryside for the English waterways, a slow, green, beautiful stretch of canal country in the Midlands, where the locks open and close with the patience of a century, and where, it turns out, certain secrets have been hidden in plain sight for a very long time. Before we cast off, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been somewhere so peaceful, so seemingly removed from the complications of ordinary life, that it was hard to believe anything dark could possibly happen there? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to know. Now settle in. The water is waiting. The Ashwater Canal began its life, in the geographical sense, at Grantley Wharf, a broad stone basin at the southern end of the navigation where narrowboats collected each autumn for the Canal Society's week-long leisure cruise. It was a grey October morning of the particularly soft Midlands variety, the kind that does not commit to rain or sun but hangs between them in a cool silver haze, making the pollarded willows along the towpath look like illustrations from a book of quiet English melancholy. The brick walls of the wharf were old and slightly mossy, the canal surface dark and perfectly still, and the smell of the place was that combination of green water, engine oil, and faint wood smoke that belongs to English waterways and nowhere else. Miss Marple had been invited on the cruise by a former colleague of Mrs. Hadley's daughter, a woman named Fellows, Mrs. Ethel Fellows, who organized the annual flotilla with the thorough, slightly breathless efficiency of a woman who has discovered, in her late 50s, a passion for organization that her previous life had not fully accommodated. She had telephoned twice in the preceding fortnight to confirm arrangements, to discuss the weather forecast, to inquire about dietary requirements, and finally to say that one of her original party had dropped out at the last moment, an elderly gentleman from Leamington who had pulled a muscle and was very sorry, and would Miss Marple care to take his place? Miss Marple had said she would be delighted, which was the truth, and had packed her knitting and her rain mackintosh and a very good library book and arrived at Grantley Wharf with the particular calm satisfaction of someone who has no specific expectations and therefore cannot be disappointed. She was, furthermore, quite fond of water in a purely observational capacity, and her doctor had recently recommended a period of rest, a medical term delivered in a tone of directed calm. Miss Marple had long ago learned to interpret such professional advice as an instruction to simply sit somewhere quiet where people gathered, knit methodically, and allow the slow rhythms of an enclosed community to reveal whatever secrets lay beneath their polite surface. The Teal was moored at the end of the wharf, a tidy 60-foot boat in blue and yellow with red trim, and its company for the week consisted of 6 persons of assorted character who had in common only their connection, however attenuated, to the Canal Society and a mutual tolerance for slow travel. There was Commander Vine, a broad, red-faced man of 60 who had been in the Royal Navy and had retained from that experience a habit of issuing statements in the manner of executive orders and an implacable distrust of civilian inefficiency. There was Miss Tabitha Ryle, a small, grey-haired woman of 53 who was a solicitor's clerk, spoke only when she had something to say, and gave the impression of someone who has spent a professional lifetime listening to other people's difficulties and has found this a very sufficient education. There was Dr. James Flack, a round, pleasant general practitioner who was professionally warm and professionally exhausted and who fell asleep in his deck chair with the practiced ease of a man who has learned to rest in short intervals. And there was Bernard Holt. Bernard Holt was a retired accountant of 68. He was a pleasant man of the sort that is pleasant in a slightly relentless way, a man who has organized his personality around pleasantness the way other men organize theirs around territory or ambition, so that it pervades everything he does and is, on extended contact, simultaneously endearing and faintly wearying. He wore good tweeds badly and carried, at all times, a small leather notebook in his breast pocket, and he had opinions about everything. He had been an accountant for 40 years and saw the world primarily in columns. He said things like "one finds" and "rather interesting" and "yes, but what do the figures actually tell us?" and he meant all of it in the best possible spirit. On the morning of their first full day, while the flotilla was waiting at Grantley Wharf for the lockkeeper to arrive and open the first gate, Bernard Holt was sitting on the bow of the Teal with his morning tea, looking at a folder of papers he had brought from home. He had mentioned the previous evening, helping an old solicitor friend to go through some old insurance files belonging to a defunct local firm, a dull enough task, he said, but he had a habit of doing two things at once, and canal travel left the hands free for paperwork. "Rather interesting thing in here, actually," he said, to no one in particular and to everyone in general, in the pleasant, carrying voice of a man who has never entirely appreciated the concept of a private observation. "There's a statistical spike, quite a marked one, in accidental drowning payouts on this very canal. Certain locks, specifically. Goes back 30 years or so. I noticed it when I was cross-referencing the Stokes ledgers last week. Probably nothing. Could be the local geography, I suppose. Certain locks are always going to be more hazardous than others, one finds." Mrs. Fellows, who was not listening, said, "How very interesting, Bernard." Miss Marple, who was listening, said nothing but looked up briefly and noted, with her customary precision, that the lockkeeper, who had arrived at the wharf gate and was working the mooring lines with the efficient silence of long habit, had paused for a fraction of a second at the phrase Stokes ledgers, and then continued his work without any change in expression. His name was Albert Pinch. He was 62, a compact, weathered man with large, capable hands and the unhurried manner of someone for whom time has always moved at the pace of canal water. He had tended this stretch of the Ashwater for 30 years. He called the boats by name and the regular passengers by their first names after one introduction, and he had that particular quality, common to lighthouse keepers, level crossing men, and certain long-serving railway porters, of seeming to be as much a feature of the landscape as the willows and the brick lock chambers, fixed and permanent and necessary. Miss Marple noticed his hands. She noticed, Also, the way he spoke about the canal, not with the enthusiasm of someone who loved a hobby, but with the quiet, factual authority of someone for whom the canal was simply the world. He did not say he loved it. He named it, described it, tended it in speech the way he tended it in practice, as a man tends a thing that is his responsibility and his meaning simultaneously. There was something in this that she found she could not immediately classify and therefore kept. The rhythm of canal travel was unlike any other rhythm of travel Miss Marple had experienced, which was saying a considerable amount. It was not the railway rhythm of arrival and departure, of platforms and whistles and the external imposition of schedule. It was something slower and more internal, the steady putter of the engine, the widening and narrowing of the waterway, the passage of the landscape at a pace that allowed one to actually see it, tree by tree, field by field, cottage by cottage. The willows were yellowing. Moorhen scattered ahead of the bow. A cormorant sat on a concrete marker post with its wings stretched out to dry, indifferent to everything. By the time the flotilla reached Merrow Bridge and its lock on the second afternoon, a community of 6 persons had already begun to reveal its internal architecture. Commander Vine had established himself as the sort of person who felt that his rank in one institution conferred authority in all subsequent ones, and he had taken to issuing suggestions about mooring procedure that the professional crew ignored with the cheerful efficiency of people who have dealt with commanders before. Miss Ryle sat in the bow of the Teal with a library book and was perfectly content. Dr. Flack dozed. Mrs. Fellows made tea at intervals that kept the communal morale reasonably well maintained. Bernard Holt alternated between his canal guidebook and his folder of insurance papers and said things about the history of the local flash locks that were more interesting than anyone gave him credit for. 3 days of close proximity on a narrow boat produced, in Miss Marple's experience, a kind of accelerated sociological study. On shore, people spread themselves out, diluted themselves in the ordinary business of separate lives. On a canal, 6 people occupied 60 feet of hull and could not, without considerable inconvenience, go anywhere else. The result was a revelation of character that would have taken a month of village dinners to equal. She had learned by the second morning that Vine's barking authority was a substitute for confidence he had stopped believing in somewhere around retirement, that Miss Ryle's silence was a form of self-respect rather than coldness, that Mrs. Fellows's incessant hospitality was love expressed in the only vocabulary she fully trusted, and that Dr. Flack's sleepiness was the sleepiness of a man who has been genuinely useful for 30 years and is slightly surprised to find himself resting. And she had been watching Bernard Holt, who was, she had decided, the most interesting of them all, not because he was subtle, he was not in the least subtle, but because he was the sort of person who said exactly what he was thinking at exactly the moment he thought it, which was, in her experience, both a very endearing quality and occasionally a dangerous one. Albert Pinch met them at Merrow Bridge. He had cycled the towpath ahead of the flotilla. This was his practice, the other boaters explained, cycling from lock to lock along his stretch to be there when the boats arrived, and he stood at the lock balance beam with the same settled patience he had shown at Grantley Wharf, working the paddle gear with the practiced economy of a man who has opened this particular lock several thousand times and expects to open it several thousand times more. The lock at Merrow Bridge was a deep one, the chamber sinking the Teel a full 8 feet into the brick-lined cut as the water drained through the lower paddles. From the bottom of the chamber, the sky appeared as a narrowed rectangle, grey and distant, and the old brick walls exhaled the mineral coldness of water and time. The chamber smelled of iron and green weed and something deep and ancient that had nothing to do with the modern navigation and everything to do with the waterway that had been here for 200 years before any of them were born. Miss Marple, watching the walls rise around the boat, thought it an oddly contemplative experience, to be lowered, steadily, into the earth, with the patience of something mechanical and very old. "She's running well today," Pinch said, leaning on the heavy oak balance beam as the dark water roiled and dropped beneath them. "Current's easy. Had some trouble last week with the gate sills, but I've seen to it. You'll have a comfortable passage through to Pilling Fen. You know every inch of this canal," Mrs. Fellows said admiringly. 30 years, Pinch said, with a slight smile that was neither proud nor modest but simply accurate. "You get to know a stretch in 30 years. I know where the navigation narrows at Dunstall, I know which mooring rings will hold and which won't, I know where the heron nests." He worked the windlass with one strong, turning motion. "The canal has its character, same as a person. You learn to read it." Miss Marple, watching from the stern where she had positioned herself with her knitting, found herself thinking about his hands again. They were the hands of a man who worked with weight and water, broad across the palm, the fingers thick and sure, the grip on the windlass handle requiring no visible effort at all. There was nothing remarkable about them in isolation. She had seen working hands on canal workers before. But she found herself returning to them, the way she returned to any detail that hovered at the edge of intelligibility without quite stepping into it, in the manner of a word one almost knew but couldn't quite place. The mist came down on Tuesday, the 4th day, thick and low and smelling of water and early winter, and Mrs. Fellows had proposed a later start than usual, on the grounds that the towpath would be slippery and the visibility poor, and everyone had agreed, which was the sort of sensible decision that becomes, in retrospect, the moment when everything changed. Bernard Holt had been up early. He always was, a lifelong habit of early rising that 40 years of accountancy had fixed in him beyond remedy. He had taken his thermos of tea and his folder of papers and gone forward along the towpath in the pale grey 6 o'clock light to look, he had said to no one in particular the night before, at the lock mechanism at Talley's Cut, which was apparently one of the oldest and most interesting on the navigation. He did not return for breakfast. It was Mrs. Fellows who first said something was wrong, at 8:15, and Dr. Flack who went along the towpath to look, and the constable from the nearest village who arrived at 9:30, and Inspector Kelby from the county town who arrived at 11 with a colleague and a notebook and the expression of a man who has received the facts of this case and is reserving judgment. Bernard Holt had been found floating face down in the lock chamber at Talley's Cut. The safety chain across the approach had been broken, or rather, unclipped and allowed to hang. The lock paddle gear had been operated recently, in the pre-dawn, which anyone with a key could do. The rush of water through an unexpectedly open paddle gate, in the mist, on a slippery approach, could easily account for a man losing his footing and going in. Inspector Kelby examined the lock mechanism with methodical care, turning the rusted ironwork over in his large hands. He stood for a long time observing the detached safety chain swaying gently in the damp morning breeze, meticulously recording each detail in his notebook. After systematically interviewing the remaining passengers in the cramped saloon for the better part of an hour, he departed with a non-committal murmur, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with unexpressed anxiety. Commander Vine said, in the irritated tone of a man being inconvenienced, that it was clearly an accident and the police should stop treating them like suspects. Miss Ryle said nothing. Dr. Flack made tea with the mechanical competence of a man who uses practical activity to process difficult information. Mrs. Fellows wept quietly in her cabin. Miss Marple sat on the stern of the Teal and looked at the broken safety chain, which was still hanging where it had been found, and thought about what it meant to be a methodical man who goes to look at a lock mechanism in the mist and does not come back. Inspector Kelby returned with considerably more urgency on the following morning, when the pathologist had had time to form opinions. He was a large, careful man of 50 who asked every question in the same formal structure and made very thorough notes and was, Miss Marple thought, the sort of policeman who would eventually arrive at the right answer by systematic elimination and would find the experience more comfortable than intuition. He was initially most interested in Commander Vine. This was understandable. Commander Vine had a debt to Holt, not enormous, but documented, a personal loan of 2 years' standing that had been mentioned, with the Vine brand of aggressive candor, in the first evening's conversation over supper, presented as a minor administrative irritation that he expected to resolve shortly. Under Kelby's patient questioning, the debt proved rather more substantial than Vine had implied, and Vine's manner under questioning, which combined furious resentment of the questions with a somewhat unconvincing account of his movements at 6 in the morning, did not improve the situation. Miss Marple watched this with the detached interest she brought to false solutions, the same mild alertness with which she watched the magician's left hand while everyone watched his right. Vine was angry about the debt and embarrassed by the questioning and would have done almost anything to avoid discussing either. He was not, she felt quite certain, a man who had got up in the dark and engineered a drowning. The anger was wrong for that. Guilty men in the presence of policemen had a specific quality of restraint, a careful management of themselves that Vine, in his blustering indignation, was entirely incapable of. Innocent men who are embarrassed, by contrast, bluster freely because they have nothing to lose by it. Vine was blustering with the magnificent freedom of a man who has done nothing worse than borrow money he cannot repay and knows it, and whose indignation at being treated as a suspect is, in its own way, the most genuine emotion in the room. She thought about the locked chamber at Talley's Cut. She thought about the safety chain, which had not been broken but unclipped, which required familiarity with the specific clip mechanism, the kind of familiarity that did not come from a week on a hired narrowboat. She thought about the paddle gear, which required a windlass key, which every boater in the flotilla had been issued at Grantley Wharf but which Pinch had been carrying on his belt since the day they left. It was here that the thought about Tommy Peel arose in her mind, arriving sideways, in the way her best thoughts always did. Tommy Peel had been a butcher's boy in St. Mary Mead, 14 years old, who had been suspected for 3 months of petty pilfering from his employer's till. The evidence against him was suggestive, he was the one who made the daily cash deposits. The losses always occurred on deposit days, and he was known to have purchased a new fishing rod in July that nobody could account for. The whole village had been quietly watching Tommy Peel. Miss Marple had been watching too, but she had been watching something else. She had been looking at his delivery book, the handwritten ledger of daily deliveries that was kept by every butcher's boy as a record of route and receipt. Tommy's book was impeccably detailed for every day except one day per week. Every Friday, the entries were reduced, the route abbreviated, several stops omitted entirely. Not because Tommy had stopped making the deliveries. He had. But someone was going with him on Fridays, someone who kept him company on the longer stretches of the route and distracted him from his notes. That someone, when Miss Marple had eventually inquired with the right lightness of touch in the right quarter, turned out to be the butcher's wife, who was pocketing cash from Friday's deposit before Tommy reached the bank, and who had chosen Tommy's day precisely because Tommy's abbreviated Fridays would be attributed, if anyone looked, to the distraction of a teenage boy with other things on his mind. The lesson, Miss Marple thought, was not about misdirection exactly. It was about where you looked and who was looking back. Everyone watched Tommy because Tommy was the obvious candidate. No one watched the person who had arranged for Tommy to be obvious. Kelby, she noted, had not yet asked Pinch anything. There was one other detail from the morning's conversation with Kelby that she turned over carefully afterward. The safety chain at Talley's cut, Kelby said, had come away from its anchor ring. The ring had been loose for some time, by the look of the fixings. He had asked Pinch about it, in passing, and Pinch had said, with immediate and helpful regret, that he had been meaning to attend to it. It was on his maintenance list. He was sorry it hadn't been seen to before the accident. A thing on a maintenance list that has not been attended to. Miss Marple was quite sure that Albert Pinch attended to every item on his maintenance list. 30 years of service on a canal navigation did not produce men who left things unattended. Heron Pool was the 7th lock on the Ashwater navigation, a wider stretch of canal where a stand of willows grew over a low bank and the water was shallow enough near the edges to show the pale gravel bottom through the reeds. A grey heron stood in the shallows with the infinite patience of a creature for whom waiting is simply existence, and Miss Marple, watching it from the stern, found it a more restful companion than most of the conversations taking place aboard the Teal. The police, having conducted a thorough review of Holt's effects, had found among his papers a bundle of personal correspondence that was not connected to the insurance files at all. The correspondence was between Holt and Miss Tabitha Ryle, and its contents, while entirely innocent of any criminal implication, were sufficiently personal in nature, the letters of two people who have been conducting a quiet, serious attachment for rather longer than either of them has mentioned to anyone, to produce in Miss Ryle a reaction of rigid, silent mortification that Kelby's constable interpreted, with some confidence, as the defensiveness of a guilty conscience. Miss Ryle said nothing. She sat very straight in her chair and answered Kelby's questions with the precise economy of a woman who has spent 30 years in a solicitor's office and knows exactly what she is legally required to say and exactly how little that is. She did not explain the letters. She did not explain her relationship with Holt. She did not weep, and she did not volunteer. Kelby circled her with patient, methodical questions, and got almost nothing from her, and left the session with the quiet certainty that she was concealing something important. Miss Marple, who had a very clear view of Miss Tabitha Ryle's face from her position by the window, thought that what she was concealing was grief, and privacy, and a very English sense that her interior life was not the police's business. None of these were evidence of guilt. But they would look, Miss Marple supposed, extremely like it, to anyone who was not watching the grief. She was watching the grief. She had known grief in many varieties. The grief of sudden shock, which was white and horizontal and blotted everything. The grief of long-anticipated loss, which came in waves and felt, between waves, almost like ordinary life. And this kind, the grief of a person who had loved quietly and privately and was now required to sit in a saloon being questioned about insurance papers, while the man she had loved quietly and privately was still in the water at Talley's cut in the professional memory of a detective sergeant. This kind was the hardest to watch, because there was nowhere for it to go. Miss Ryle could not weep. She could not explain. She could only be precisely what she had always been, a woman who said what she meant and no more, and waited for the questions to end. Miss Marple was also watching the Heron, which had not moved in 40 minutes, and she was thinking about Lock 5 and the windlass key and the particular quality of Pinch's helpfulness at every stage of the police investigation, present, cooperative, quietly informative, consistently deflecting attention toward the practical and away from the personal. He had been the first to suggest that the safety chain had been a known weakness. He had been the one to mention, casually, that Vine had been seen near the forward boats in the early morning, a detail that Vine's own account had not volunteered. He had, on 2 separate occasions, found reasons to be precisely where the police were conducting their inquiries, offering useful context, answering questions that had not been asked of him. It was a very specific quality of helpfulness. It was the helpfulness of a man who has decided that the best place to be when people are looking for something is standing beside the searcher, pointing in useful directions. The searcher feels assisted. The searcher feels grateful. The searcher does not notice that he is being steered. Miss Marple had noticed. But she was not yet ready to speak. She needed one more thing, something from the ledger that she had been turning over since Fenwick Reach. She needed the dates. It was at Lock 8 that the situation became, in Miss Marple's private assessment, considerably more serious. The Teal had moored for the evening at Pilling Fen, a flat, treeless stretch of canal bank with a good mooring and the sound of lapwing somewhere in the dark distance, and Mrs. Fellows had made cocoa, which she distributed with the nurturing efficiency of a woman who processes distress by feeding people, and they had all retired at a reasonable hour. Dr. Flack had been tired since early afternoon and had gone to his cabin at 8, taking his cocoa with him. At 10:30, Mrs. Fellows heard a sound from the well deck and went out to find Dr. Flack there, sitting on the step with his head in his hands, the cocoa mug on its side and a thin dark stain of it already soaking into the non-slip matting. He was conscious but deeply confused, his speech slurred and his movements clumsy, and his first coherent sentence, delivered some 20 minutes later after being helped inside and given water, was that he did not understand what had happened and that he thought he should ring his wife. It was not food poisoning. It was not a stroke. Dr. Flack had been sedated. Kelby was summoned and arrived at midnight, and the mug was bagged, and Dr. Flack, who recovered his faculties in stages over the course of the night, sat in the saloon looking shaken and thoughtful, and eventually said that he had been meaning to tell someone something and now seemed as good a time as any. On the morning of Bernard Holt's death, he had been awake at 6:10, one of his early waking mornings. He had not mentioned it because it had not seemed relevant, and he had been standing at the well-deck hatch for some air. And he had seen, in the mist at the approach to Talley's cut, Albert Pinch walking away from the lock along the towpath toward the maintenance hut. He had not thought anything of it at the time. Pinch was always early. Pinch was always somewhere on the canal. But afterward, when the police had been asking about timelines, he had found himself turning it over, wondering whether it mattered, and had been in the process of deciding to mention it when his cocoa had rendered the question temporarily academic. Miss Marple, sitting in the corner of the saloon listening to all of this, thought, "There it is." Pinch had been at Talley's cut that morning. Flack had seen him. Flack had been about to say so. And someone had put something in Flack's cocoa to buy time. She looked at the saloon, at the small galley where the mugs had been prepared, at the door that led to the stern, which was the side of the boat nearest the towpath, and she thought about how easy it would have been for a man who knew this boat's layout and had been aboard it twice already to assist with mooring, to step from the towpath to the stern in the dark and add something to an unattended mug. She thought about Pinch's hands, and about what hands like that could do at a lock gate in the early morning mist. She said nothing that night. She was not yet ready. Fenwick Reach was Pinch's home lock, the lock for which he served as the principal keeper, the one with the whitewashed keeper's cottage set back from the towpath behind a garden of dahlias gone ragged with October frost and runner beans long past their season. The cottage was low and old and extremely well maintained, the kind of building that looks modest and is, in fact, a record of 30 years of patient care. Pinch welcomed the flotilla himself, worked the gates with his customary unhurried competence, and then, with the naturalness of a man who has extended this hospitality 100 times, invited the party to come in for tea while the boats rested at the mooring. It was a civilized afternoon, the cottage warm and smelling of beeswax and something baking, Pinch's wife having left a cake on the table before visiting her sister in Coventry. The party distributed themselves among the chairs and the small sofa and accepted tea and were, almost despite themselves, grateful for the ordinariness of it, the tick of the mantel clock, the warmth, the sense of a life lived with quiet competence in a settled place. Miss Marple, at a moment when the company was engaged with cake and conversation, stepped into the kitchen on the pretext of asking for a little more hot water for the teapot. The kitchen was neat, functional, and lined on one wall with a shelf of ring binders and ledgers, the administrative record of a professional lockkeeper who kept everything in order. She looked at them with the unhurried attention of a woman who is merely waiting for the kettle to boil. Canal maintenance records. Annual inspection logs. Equipment inventories. Work diaries going back, by the date on the spines, 28 years. She pulled one from the middle of the row, 1961, and opened it at random. Pinch's handwriting was small, precise, entirely consistent. Weekly entries. Dates, work performed, equipment checked, issues noted. She scanned the entries with the rapid absorption of a woman who has, over many years, become very fast at reading administrative documents. There was nothing wrong with the entries. They were meticulous, complete, entirely professional. That was precisely what she was looking for. She found the first one in April, a notation of urgent maintenance required at Lock 4, which had taken Pinch off his ordinary route for 2 days. She found another in August, urgent repairs to the lock sill at Lock 7, 3 days. She memorized the dates. She replaced the binder. She poured the hot water and went back to the sitting room. Later that evening, on the stern of the Teal in the dark, she turned those dates over in her mind with the precise deliberateness of a woman doing arithmetic she is not in a hurry to complete. There had been, back in St. Mary Mead, a woman who kept bees. Her name was Mrs. Edith Tench, and she had been keeping bees since before the war and was very well regarded for her honey, which was dark and particularly good on toast. She sold it at the village fete every year and always had more than any other year of comparable weather. The summer of 1952 had been truly terrible, wet and cold, and the flowers a month behind, and everyone in the village knew that the bees had done nothing and that Mrs. Tench would have very little to offer that year. And yet at the fete, she had 12 jars, same as always, same dark color, same excellent flavor. Miss Marple had looked at Mrs. Tench's record book. She kept a detailed apiarist's record, 30 years of it, colonies and swarms and extraction dates and yields, and found that in the summer of 1952, there was no extraction record. Not a reduced extraction. No extraction at all. The honey had not come from Mrs. Tench's hives that summer. It had been bought from a wholesaler in Leamington and relabeled and sold at a price that reflected the reputation of a genuine local product rather than the cost of a commercial one. The point, Miss Marple reflected, was not that the honey was bad. It was not. The point was that a methodical woman who records everything does not leave an entry blank unless nothing happened. Mrs. Tench's record book had no extraction entry for 1952 because she had done no extraction. What the ledger did not say was, in this case, the only true thing about it. Albert Pinch's maintenance record showed urgent work at specific locks on specific dates. But they did not, she was quite certain, show anything about what those dates corresponded to in the insurance records that Bernard Holt had been reading. She needed to see Holt's folder. The police had retained Holt's folder of insurance papers, but Kelby had mentioned, in his methodical way, that they were still awaiting a response from the London Insurance Archive about the firm in question, and that the papers themselves were not, in his current assessment, central to the investigation. He had said this in the tone of a man who has a main theory and does not wish to be distracted from it. Miss Marple asked, very pleasantly, whether she might look at the papers for a short while. She was an old friend of the family solicitor, she said, and Mr. Holt had mentioned the papers to her, and she had a small interest in insurance matters from her nephew's business. Kelby, who had not yet found Miss Marple actively inconvenient, agreed with the slight surprise of a man who expects old ladies to ask to look at knitting patterns rather than actuarial documents. The papers were brought to her at the mooring at Sallow Mill, and she sat in the saloon with her reading glasses and spent 40 minutes going through them with the absorbed, rapid efficiency of a woman who has always been considerably faster at reading figures than people expect. The drowning statistics were on the third page of the cross-reference table. They were unmistakable once you knew to look for them, a clustering of accidental drowning payouts, at specific locks on the Ashwater navigation, over a period of 31 years, each payout authorized by the same agent. The name at the foot of the authorization column, Edmund Stokes. Agent. Deceased 1951. She looked at the dates. She set them against the dates she had memorized from Pinch's maintenance record in the cottage at Fenwick Reach. They matched. Every single one. An urgent maintenance closure at Lock 3, 2 days in March 1953. A payout authorized to the family of an itinerant barge worker drowned at Lock 3 in March 1953. An urgent maintenance closure at Lock 7, 3 days in August 1961. A payout to the widow of a retired schoolmaster drowned at Lock 7 in August 1961. Again, and again, and again. Pinch had been closing the locks for maintenance on the days that people drowned in them. The closures would have given him solitude, legitimate reason to be present, legitimate authority to operate the gates. And for 30 years, Edmund Stokes had been authorizing the insurance payouts, to families, to estates, to whoever was named, and skimming a portion, and keeping the rest moving through a canal navigation that the county council had twice proposed filling in for lack of revenue. She found Kelby. Ashwater Junction was a wide basin where the navigation met a disused arm of the old quarry canal, and the flotilla had been held there since mid-morning at Kelby's request while he made a series of telephone calls from the Junction master's office. The mood aboard the Teal was uneasy and still, the way moods are when people know something is happening but do not know precisely what. The Insurance Archive in London responded by midday telegram. Kelby read it in the Junction master's office and came out with the expression of a man whose systematic elimination has arrived, faster than expected, at a remaining answer. Miss Marple, in the afternoon, walked along the towpath to Pinch's maintenance hut, which was at the Junction's northern end, ostensibly to return a borrowed milk jug that Mrs. Fellows had been meaning to return since Fenwick Reach. Pinch was outside, tying back the last of his climbing roses along the hut's south wall, the kind of methodical autumn task that has its own seasonal authority. "Lovely afternoon for it," he said cheerfully, taking the jug. "Isn't it?" Miss Marple agreed. She stood beside him for a moment, looking at the roses. "Mr. Pinch, I was thinking about something you said when we first met, at Merrow Bridge, I believe it was. You said you never forget a face on the canal. That you know all the regular passengers by sight." "That's right," Pinch said easily. "When you're on a stretch 30 years, the faces come around." "It struck me as rather remarkable," Miss Marple said, in her most pleasantly conversational tone. "Because when Inspector Kelby asked you whether you had seen Mr. Holt near the Talley's cut approach on the morning he died, you said you hadn't noticed him." You were out checking the moorings at dawn, I think you said. But a man who never forgets a face, she let the sentence trail away, gently, as though she had simply run out of words. Pinch's hand stilled on the rose stem. Not dramatically, there was no sudden freezing, no jerk of alarm. It was the briefest possible pause, the duration of a single breath held and released, and then his hands continued their work. But she had seen it. The light was poor, he said. Dawn mist. Easy to miss someone. Yes, Miss Marple said. I expect it is. She thanked him for the conversation and walked back to the teal, and she thought, he knows that I know. And he knows there is nothing I can prove from that alone. And he is deciding what to do about it. She found Kelby before supper and spoke to him for a long time in the Junction master's office, while the light faded over the Junction basin and the first stars appeared over the flat Midland sky. Lock 12 was the last lock on the Ashwater navigation. Below it, the canal broadened into the modern river system, and the towpath ended, and the willows gave way to concrete bank reinforcement and the institutional grey of the Navigation Authority infrastructure. It was not a picturesque terminus, but it had the particular distinction of finality, the sense of a thing completed. Kelby had ordered the other boats to hold at the junction. The teal came forward alone to Enderton Gate, carrying only Miss Marple and the crew, while Kelby's constables positioned themselves in the tree line behind the lockkeeper's hut with the patient invisibility of men experienced in waiting. Albert Pinch was at the lock when they arrived. He had cycled ahead, as he always did, as he had done every day of this week's cruise and every week's cruise for 30 years. He stood at the heavy balance beam with his hand on the wood, watching the teal nose into the chamber, and his face, in the pale October afternoon light, was entirely composed. Miss Marple stepped from the bow of the boat onto the lock side and walked over to him. The water in the chamber was dark and still. A heron stood in the reeds 20 yards away with its perpetual, mechanical patience. It is very peaceful at the end of the day, Miss Marple said. Always is, Pinch agreed, looking out across the water. Especially at this end of the stretch. No through traffic after 4. They stood side by side for a moment in the kind of silence that precedes something inevitable, the way the air goes quiet just before rain. I looked at your maintenance ledger at Fenwick Reach, Miss Marple said. I hope you'll forgive the liberty. I was waiting for the kettle. Pinch said nothing. He kept his eyes on the water. 31 years of dates, she continued, in the same unhurried conversational tone with which she might have discussed the weather or the state of the towpath. Every urgent closure corresponded, with remarkable consistency, to a date recorded in Edmund Stokes's insurance ledger as a paid accidental drowning claim. Remarkable consistency is not coincidence. I'm sure you know that, as a man who has spent 30 years understanding how this canal works, how its figures work, as well as its water. The balance beam was warm under his hand. He gripped it, slightly. Bernard Holt was an accountant for 40 years, Miss Marple said. He noticed the statistical anomaly in the Stokes ledger the way he noticed everything, pleasantly, and aloud, and without any understanding of what he was saying. He didn't know what the pattern meant. He only knew it was there. But you heard him say Stokes ledgers at Grantley Wharf, and you understood immediately what it meant. And you could not afford for a man with 40 years of auditing instinct to spend a week on this canal with that file. Pinch took his cap off slowly and turned it in his hands. He did not look at her. The canal surface was perfectly still and perfectly dark, reflecting nothing. The safety chain at Talley's Cut had been on your maintenance list for weeks, Miss Marple continued. You never left things on your maintenance list. But you left that one, because a loose chain at that approach, on a misty morning, would account for a man losing his footing. You were there when he arrived. He came alone, as you knew he would. He was always the first up, everyone on the boat knew it. You opened the paddle gate too fast. The rush of water through the lower culvert, the broken chain, the early morning ice on the approach, it would account for everything. And it very nearly did. Dr. Flack, Pinch said, without inflection. Yes. He saw you walking away from Talley's Cut in the dawn mist. He hadn't decided, at that point, whether it mattered. But you knew him, the way you know everyone on this stretch, and you knew he was the sort of man who turns things over. And you could not have him turn this particular thing over. She paused. The cocoa was a temporary measure. You are, by nature, a man who prefers permanent measures to temporary ones. But I think, with Dr. Flack, you hesitated. Pinch was silent for a long time. The heron in the reeds had not moved. The teal sat still in the lock chamber below them. The afternoon light was failing, the sky going amber and grey over the flat Midlands horizon. Edmund and I started it in '49, he said finally. His voice was steady, even reflective, as though he were discussing a professional decision of long ago that had simply not come up recently. The council was going to fill the navigation in. There was no revenue. The working boats were dying. Edmund had access to the policies, he wrote them, he approved the claims. We only took the ones who wouldn't be missed too much. Men on their own. Men no one was looking for. He turned the cap in his hands. The money kept this canal alive. Kept the gates maintained, the navigation open. Every pleasure boat that uses this waterway uses it because Edmund and I kept it going when the council wanted to bury it. You killed people, Miss Marple said, quietly, and without anger. I helped the canal take what it would have taken anyway, in time. Men who drank. Men alone. The water is patient. The water did not make the decision, Miss Marple said. You did. There was a long silence. A moorhen crossed the far bank in the last of the light, leaving a thin V on the dark water. Pinch looked at his hands. Mr. Holt, he said. I never, he stopped. I know, Miss Marple said gently. He was not the sort of man you had chosen before. He was the sort of man who noticed things. That was the only difference. You have been very kind to a great many people on this canal over many years, Mr. Pinch. And very cruel to one or two. I think you know which you would prefer to be remembered for." Pinch looked up at her, just once, and what was in his eyes was not defiance and not calculation but something older and tireder than either, the look of a man who has been holding up a very heavy, precarious weight for 30 years, and has finally allowed it to drop. "I think," he said, "I should like to speak to Inspector Kelby myself. Now, if you'd be kind enough to ask him to come out." The constables emerged from the tree line. Kelby came across the lock side with the measured pace of a man who has waited long enough and is in no hurry now that the waiting is over. Pinch held out his hands, those large, capable, 30-year hands, and said nothing further. Miss Marple stood on the towpath as the evening deepened into bruised purple dusk, and she stayed there long after the police car had gone around the curve of the towpath road and its headlights had disappeared. She stood, and she thought about the canal, and about the 30 years of it, and about what it meant to love a thing so completely that you allowed that love to become the justification for something terrible. She had known people who did this with gardens, with houses, with families, with dynasties. The object of love was always blameless. The love was always real. It was the reasoning built upon the love that was the corruption, the slow, patient, barely noticed reasoning that said, "This thing I love is worth preserving, and therefore whatever preserves it is justified, and therefore I am justified, and therefore I have done nothing wrong." She had seen this reasoning applied by clever people and by simple people and by people of every variety between, and it had never, in her experience, led anywhere other than where Albert Pinch was going now, in the back of a police car on a cold October evening, with the canal running alongside him, indifferent and dark and entirely innocent of his particular understanding of it. The lock gates remained closed tight behind her, holding back the dark water with the exact same patient, mechanical certainty they had maintained for 30 years. In the shallows near the reeds, the grey heron stood entirely motionless, waiting with its ancient, indifferent patience for whatever the water might eventually bring. And that is where we leave the Ashwater Canal tonight, those still, dark waters that look, from the towpath, like perfect peace. There is a particular quality to slow travel, isn't there? The sense that you have left the complications of the faster world behind, that the canal exists in a different order of time. Albert Pinch had been counting on that feeling for 30 years. He had counted on the water's patience, on the quietness of the life, on the distance between this narrow green world and the one where questions get properly asked. He had been right, for 30 years. And then he was not. He had almost been right. Thank you for making this journey with me tonight at Midnight Pages. I'd love to hear from you in the comments, particularly about Pinch. A man who committed terrible acts in the service of something he genuinely loved. Does that complicate how you feel about what he did? Does it change things, that he loved the canal so completely? Tell me. Subscribe if you haven't yet, there are more mysteries waiting. Keep the lamp burning brightly out there. I will see you next time. Good night.